I'm so mad about the iPhone 14 Pro launch. I am a huge Apple fanboy. I got my MacBook here. This cost me like $7,000 or something. I got the Watch 7 that I just ordered the Ultra replacement for. I use the AirPods Max and the AirPods Pro in different situations. And of course, I'm currently using the iPhone 13 Pro. I need Apple, not just for my personal life, but for my work life. And you can see I've gotten myself locked into this Apple infrastructure that they've deliberately made very difficult to leave. The iPhone has become one of my most important cameras that I need for work. And Apple kind of screwed us over with this latest launch, but they also deliberately deceived a lot of us by using math against us. So I'm going to go through that and prove their deception with a little bit of mathematics. First, let's recap the models. Apple's launching an iPhone 14, which is 6.1 inches, and an iPhone 14 Plus, which is 6.7 inches. Those are very nice. They have 1200 nit screens, and they come in storage from 128 gigs to 512 gigs, which should be plenty for everybody. Those each have two cameras on the back, a 13mm ultrawide and a 26mm main lens. Now, they didn't give us the pixel pitch or sensor size for those, but there's a very good chance that they are almost untouched. So I won't go into much detail because the fact of the matter is those serious creators among us for whom the camera specs really matter are probably going to spring for the Pro models anyway. Those Pro models come in the same sizes. They're called the iPhone 14 Pro at 6.1 inches and the Pro Max at 6.7 inches. I myself favor the bigger screen. These have some significant improvements. First, you can get them at up to 1 terabyte, something that I will probably do when I pre-order it tomorrow because I like to offload footage from my real cameras and keep it as a backup when I'm traveling. And a terabyte can be pretty easy to fill up when you're filming 4K 60 frames per second video. One of the biggest improvements is that the screens are advertising 1600 nits or up to 2000 nits. And that means that they're going to be very readable in bright sunlight. And especially as a drone operator, that allows me to see what's happening on my drone much better. And that will allow me to just make better footage in bright situations. But also, I use my smartphone a lot for filming out in bright sunlight, even just to get B-roll, but sometimes A-roll too. And on my conventional cameras, the screen can be very hard to see. So the brighter screen, definitely a big benefit of that. Thank you, Apple. But now let's get to the kind of deceptive part. And that happens when they describe the cameras and the lenses. Now, on the Pro models, the ultra wide angle lens is still an equivalent 13 millimeters focal length. But the ultra wide lens has a big improvement. To understand the improvement, you really need to understand a little bit about the relationship between the camera's sensor size and the opening on the front of the lens, which we call the aperture, as well as how the industry describes it. And the industry uses just a terrible standards for describing these things. Typically, the angle of view, how wide angle it is described in what we call 35 millimeter focal length. Now, that is the focal length of a lens on a 35 millimeter camera, and these lenses look like this, and the cameras look like this. They're really big, and it goes back to 35 millimeter film days. So when Apple says the lens is 13 millimeters, that is not a measurement of anything on the lens at all. The lens is actually much, much smaller than 13 millimeters, but 13 millimeters would be the size of the lens on a 35 millimeter film camera. So they calculate the actual angle of view and then figure out the equivalent angle of view with a 35 millimeter camera and then tell you that because that's the number that everybody's familiar with. But 13 millimeters is not a physical measurement of any aspect of it. Now, they also tell you the aperture, but that is a physical measurement of the aperture, not the 35 millimeter equivalent aperture. But that's where it gets confusing because Apple pitched this lens as 13 millimeters f2.4. If you look at how the f-stops, the aperture, is calculated, you'll see that there are exactly two factors in calculating this, and one of those is the physical focal length. So when they calculate the aperture, they do not use that 13 millimeters that they told you because that's not the physical focal length. They use the physical focal length, which they did not readily advertise, and that results in f2.4. But if you use the 35 millimeter equivalent focal length, then you would come up with f10. So now you know exactly what you're going to get. That is very powerful and very important. But what you don't get is a 13 millimeter f2.4 lens. And indeed, it's mathematically impossible. If you took algebra, then you know you cannot add something to one side of the equation and not add it to the other. We cannot use the physical focal length when calculating the aperture, but use the 35mm equivalent focal length for the angle of view, and then just combine those two together, since focal length is a factor in the aperture. If you want to know more about that, I have an entire video series on crop factor. Otherwise, you can just trust me. Now, the ultrawide lens is the only big upgrade on the iPhone 14 Pro. 13mm f10 is a significant improvement over 13mm f15, which my iPhone 13 Pro has. That means you're going to be gathering about a full stop more light. That is about the same as upgrading from an APS-C camera to a full frame camera, or upgrading your lens from f4 to f2.8. And that alone is reason enough for me to want to upgrade, because I use that ultrawide a lot, especially because it's also the macro lens and I do a lot of close-up work. Now let's talk about the main lens, which is what most people use most of the time. Apple bragged a lot about this. They told you that it was 24mm f1.78, and that would be fantastic. That would be a very nice prime lens on a full frame camera, something that would look about like this big lens, right? Except nestled in here. So how do they create this magic? Well, they don't. They use just deceptive math. They're giving you the physical aperture and the equivalent focal length and combining these two completely incompatible numbers. It's as if a manufacturer told you a car got 30 miles per gallon and did 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, but they didn't tell you that the 0 to 60 was measured in kilometers, right? They're using completely different units of measurement. The main lens on the iPhone 14 Pro is 24mm f6.3. Now the iPhone 13 Pro is 26mm f6.8. And lower f-stop numbers are better, so you can see that the new iPhone 14 Pro lens is a little bit faster, but it's also a little bit wider. And some people are mad about that because they didn't want it to be wider. I like 24mm better than 26mm, but there is a big catch here. While the new lens is a little bit better, a little bit faster, it should perform better in low light, it only gives you better results when you're shooting completely wide angle. As soon as you zoom or crop from 24 down to 26mm, a very small amount, the lens will produce exactly the same results. So really the only difference is that it's a little bit wider. That extra light that it gathers is just sort of the extra light that it's gathering out on the outside of the image. The other big upgrade, and this sounds huge, is going from 12 megapixels on the iPhone 13 Pro to 48 megapixels on the iPhone 14 Pro. But there's a huge catch here. This is a quad bare sensor, which means basically 4 pixels are generally combined to make a single pixel, and 48 divided by 4 is 12. So it's essentially a 12 megapixel sensor that has 4 subpixels for every pixel. Now, we've tested this over and over again. Pretty much all the new Android phones and a lot of new conventional cameras use quad bare sensors. And every single time I've tested them, I have seen no improvement over sensors with 1/4 the megapixels. In fact, the Google Pixel 6 advertises a 48 megapixel sensor, but then it only outputs 12 megapixel images because Google's figured it out, right? It's good to advertise high megapixels, but if you're not producing more detail, then nobody simply wants to deal with bigger files. It seems like that's the first way that Apple is stealing from Google. They're simply going to scale down these 48 megapixel images to 12 megapixels because after all, the 48 megapixels was never worth anything anyway. Now, one thing Apple will do is they're giving you what's called ProRAW. And other professional photographers like myself appreciate RAW because it gives you so much more latitude when editing. This ProRAW will actually take all the benefits of computational photography and bake that into the RAW file so you can actually get more dynamic range and potentially 48 megapixels of detail. Now, how much of that detail we're actually able to extract remains to be seen. When I've tested other cameras that provide raw output from the quad bare sensor, I see no additional detail over simply scaling it down to 12 megapixels. In post-processing, I just see nothing. So I suspect it's going to be worthless, but subscribe and we will actually test it as real photographers who test real cameras so that you know exactly what you're getting, because that is so important. So here's another way that Apple ripped off the Google Pixel. they're giving you a 2x lens, which is not a real lens, not a physical lens. It is a virtual lens. The 2x is made by cropping 2 times into that 24mm lens to produce essentially 48mm. In 35mm terms, this would be a 48mm f12.6 lens, which is not impressive at all. That would be very bad in low light. They're advertising it as 12 megapixels because it's using 1/4 of the previously mentioned 48 megapixel sensor, except of course that 48 megapixel sensor is really only a 12 megapixel sensor, and thus these resulting images are going to be 3 megapixels. Now this is exactly what the Google Pixel 6 does, and I've already tested that, and those cropped images look like garbage. Even though it outputs 12 megapixel images, they look absolutely terrible. And as a result, we did not recommend it for portraits where you would be zooming in and using that 2x lens because the quality was abysmal. It made me look like a monster because it was taking essentially a 3 megapixel image and scaling it up. Now, it remains to be seen. We will test it in our full review, but the iPhone 14 Pro is going to be doing the same thing. And there's an old saying, garbage in, garbage out. You cannot overcome the limitations of physics. So I'm confident that 2x lens is going to produce terrible results, but subscribe to see it. Now, there's also a third telephoto lens that the Pro models get that the standard models do not get, and that is essentially unchanged. Apple essentially punted here. In 35mm terms, they gave us the same 77mm f24 lens that the iPhone 13 has, and okay, for portraits, it does great with the computational bokeh and all that. I like it, but it would have been nice to see some improvement, right? Especially because this exists. This is the Samsung S22 Ultra, and it has, in 35mm terms, a 230mm f42 lens that produces fantastic results. Like, I got beautiful wildlife video footage handheld with it, and I was so hoping to see something like that in the iPhone. And in fact, I feel kind of robbed because I need a good telephoto lens on the camera that I have with me all the time. But I'm an Apple user, and you can see I'm locked into the infrastructure. So no, I can't just switch to the Pixel or the Samsung freely. In fact, I did. I used Samsung and Pixel at different times in my life, and I irritated my family so much that they asked me to go back to the iPhone. Why? Because you airdrop images when you're out together as a group. You're in iMessage, text message groups all the time, and Apple made a deliberate choice to prevent Android from interacting with iMessage in a meaningful way, specifically to lock people into their infrastructure. And I'm one of these poor suckers who's locked into the Apple infrastructure. And the least I asked, if you lock me in this walled garden, is to give me a decent telephoto lens. Let's go over the video specs, but they're almost unchanged. It still offers 4K 60 HDR video, which we use all the time. It looks fantastic, admittedly. It also offers slow motion at up to 240 frames per second at 1080p, which doesn't look great, but does work okay for that purpose. The cinematic video, which I actually love on the iPhone 13, they have upped the frame rate to 30 frames per second from 24 frames per second, and because we're a 60 frames per second channel, that makes it work much easier for us. I've used it in a pinch many times, and people do not notice the difference between that and a more expensive camera. They're also giving us ProRes at 4K and 30 frames per second, and ProRes, who cares? First of all, other camera manufacturers have to pay a lot to integrate ProRes because Apple owns the licensing to that. So Apple can just kind of throw it in for free since they own it, but you probably will never need it. Like, technically you might be able to really squint and see some difference in video quality, but for the most part you're just getting much bigger files without any real benefit in your workflow. Something I am excited about is the addition of action mode, which records at 2.8K and 60 frames per second. And action mode is, well, it's just ripping off GoPro and DJI action and Insta360, where it uses a super wide angle lens and then crops down some, giving it a lot of latitude for sort of moving around in that frame, and it produces gimbal-like images. And I totally believe the images that they've shown because I've been using that on GoPro and DJI and Insta360 for several years now. So it's nice that it's now integrated into my phone. You know, there was a time when Apple was leading these innovations instead of just copying things from competitors 2 or 3 years later. I appreciate that Apple always integrates it well. It always works as you'd expect it to in an intuitive way. But at the same time, I miss the Steve Jobs Apple where they really wowed me. You'll be able to pre-order all the different iPhone 14s on September 9th tomorrow, and they'll be shipping on September 16th, and I'm gonna order mine right away and get the review video up as soon as I can. Now, a lot of you watching this use traditional cameras, and you're gonna say, why don't you just use your traditional camera for everything? So here's a list of reasons that the iPhone is one of the tools that I use, as well as additional cameras. Now, first of all, I have my iPhone with me anyway. I have to buy one anyway because I use it for communications. I use it for social media. It's literally the only device that can do like live streams to Instagram or TikTok, and thus I can't get around having it, but it's always in my pocket, so it's extremely convenient. This also makes it extremely discreet. You actually look weirder if you don't have your phone out in public situations, right? So I can take pictures without anybody questioning me like they would if I picked up a big Nikon Z9 and pointed it at somebody. They're also extremely weatherproof. Okay, I can go swimming with this in my pocket and it's fine. So if I get rained on or if I drop it, especially in its case, it's gonna be fine, whereas my traditional cameras would probably be wrecked. The screen is several times brighter than even my very best cameras, which make them much easier to use in bright conditions. Another pro feature is that all of my information is constantly backed up to the cloud. So literally, if my phone gets destroyed or stolen, I have a copy of all of my pictures. And a lot of the work I do, the pictures are more valuable than the device itself. So that's extremely important to me. We frequently travel and need to share videos and images on social media. Smartphones can capture, edit, and publish from a single device. There's no need to take that extra step of transferring it to another device like I would have to do with a traditional camera. But when I do need to transfer from my phone to my laptop for editing in Final Cut, it happens via AirPlay. It's much quicker than taking out a memory card. Also, these devices have anti-theft built in. I can remotely track this. I can remotely lock it so that nobody else can sell it. And that means that I'm not as big of a target of theft carrying this around as I am something like this. And I've had a friend of mine shot at. I know other photographers who were killed for their cameras. And traditional camera manufacturers have done nothing to integrate any sort of anti-theft. You can see here I have an AirTag there just to prevent me from losing it, but it's not a great anti-theft thing because any thief would just immediately take that off. So if I'm in a big city or something and I don't feel like risking being robbed or potentially killed, then my iPhone is perfect for that. On the off chance that Apple actually listens to me, a real photographer, I want to give them some goals. First of all, if you're going to be stealing from Google Pixel anyway, could you please give us the long exposures and panning features that Google has had? Because they work fantastically and long exposures on this suck. I know you can go into live view and set it to long exposure, but because you're stacking multiple images taken with a slight delay between them, things like flowing water don't end up feathery smooth, they end up really jagged. And then I had to carry around a big camera and put an ND filter on it. Also, there's still no physical aperture, and there are times when I would want to shut that aperture down, partly to make longer exposures, but also to bring the background more in focus. The Sony Xperia Pro I has that. Rip that off if you're gonna rip something off. And give me some better astro. The Google Pixel here will actually track stars as they move through the frame, allowing me to take 4-minute exposures that produce much cleaner images of the stars without blurring trees moving in the wind in the foreground. It's absolutely stunning, and they've had it for years. Your launch event promo had stars in it, and then there was nothing for us astrophotographers. Step up, Apple. I also really want a physical shutter button, like on the Sony Xperia smartphones, and I would really love a way to trigger external flashes. Now, I know ProPhoto has some very expensive strobe, but I need a more general way to trigger external flashes because using continuous lights on models is not fun for their eyes. Nobody wants their eyes burned in with some super bright softbox. And finally, just from a planning perspective, something I'm doing constantly is unlocking my phone and then going in and checking the weather app and then looking at the hourly report to see exactly when the sun is going to be setting and what the cloud cover is going to be like. I have to look at radar. I use this to plan photo shoots every day. If I could just have that on the lock screen, what the current cloud cover is, what it's going to be in the next few hours, when sunrise, sunset is, what the moon phase is, I need that on the lock screen. Can you just give me some basic information on the lock screen? Android phones do that. Okay, rant over. In the comments down below, tell me what you think of the new iPhone 14 Pro, Plus, Max, and whether you're pre-ordering it or not, subscribe to see our upcoming full review where we will scrutinize these images and tell you whether photographers, videographers, creators should actually buy it, or if it's just marketing nonsense. Bye.